the next we'll be going into now is there's some part of the foregut here. So the part of the foregut we'll be talking about is the esophagus. So remember, the foregut begins from the pharyngeal gut, the pharyngeal tube rather, down to the liver bud, which is the liver outgrowth that forms the liver. So in this foregut here, we'll be dealing with the esophagus, and in the esophagus, how is the esophagus formed? Naturally, we remember that the respiratory diverticulum is forming in the ventral wall. The respiratory diverticulum is forming the ventral wall of the foregut, which forms an outpouch, and that outpouch, which is the long bud, communicate with the foregut. It communicates with the foregut. There's two longitudinal ridge there. The longitudinal ridge forms what we call the tracheoesophageal ridge. The tracheoesophageal ridge is two longitudinal ridge that is not fused yet, but after during proliferation, the ridge closes to form the tracheoesophageal septum. The tracheoesophageal septum. In the ventral part, it forms the trachea, which is what we call the respiratory primordium, while the dorsal part forms the esophagus. Don't forget. So the esophagus, which is the dorsal part, first of all, is shortened. It's shortened because of the formation is not yet elongated. So the shortness of it. But one thing you know that it gets elongated. It gets elongated as the lungs and the heart is descending into the thoracic cavity, because at first they are formed in the head region, which is the pharyngeal membrane, which is at the head region. Then during craniocaudal folding, as the heart is descending into the chest, what happens? The esophagus elongates with it, and as it elongates with it, it sits in the abdominal region when it passes through the diaphragm at first. So now when it elongates, now don't forget the elongation of the esophagus sits in the abdominal cavity due to the descent of the lungs and the heart. So now what happens now? Now at first the esophagus is just like a cord. It's just like a cord. So now recanalization is just that. It's the opening of the esophagus occurs at the 8th week. So the recanalization of the esophagus, whereby the lumen of the esophagus begins to open. It begins to open at the 8th week, whereby now content in the oropharyngeal membrane can be transmitted to the esophagus to the other part of the GIT tract. Don't forget it. So recanalization or vocalization occurs in the 8th week, while the descent occurs in the 4th week, when the heart and the lungs begin to descend into the thoracic cavity. Don't forget it. One thing you have to know that the muscular coat around the esophagus is formed by the splanchic mesenchyme. The splanchic mesenchyme, which is a part of the mesoderm, forms the muscular coat around the esophagus. But now one thing you have to know that they are innervated. The upper two-thirds is innervated by the vagus nerve. So most of the part, the upper two-thirds or greater part, is innervated by the vagus nerve, while the smaller part, the lower one-third, is innervated by the splanchic plexus. The splanchic plexus. So don't forget. For the congenital malformation or the congenital abnormality of the esophagus is very easy. In the congenital abnormality of the esophagus, what happens? So now there's what we call the esophageal atresia. The esophageal atresia or the tracheoesophageal fistula. How can this form? It's when, now what happens when there's posterior deviation of the posterior part, when there's the spontaneous posterior deviation of the esophagus from the tracheoesophageal septum. This can also happen, or when there's some mechanical factor that causes the dorsal part of the foregut to move anterior. So when the dorsal part of the foregut move anterior, or there is a spontaneous posterior deviation of the esophagus from the tracheoesophageal septum, you can have what we call tracheoesophageal fistula. Now this, in 90% of the cases, what happens? The proximal part of the esophagus forms an end blind sac, while the distal part of the esophagus is fused to the trachea at the bifurcation, at that bifurcation part. The distal end of the esophagus is fused at that side, while the proximal part forms a blind sac in 90% of the cases. So in 90% of the cases, it can form in different ways. Both of them can form blind sac. They might not be connected to the trachea, both of them. So both of them can form, the proximal and distal end can form a blind sac, but that is in 1% of the case. Now it can also be that the distal end is connected, the proximal end is connected, and distal end is not connected. But one thing about this fistula can prevent what amniotic fluid to pass through the esophagus of the growing fetus, and which will cause increase in excessive what amniotic fluid in the amniotic sac, causing what we call polyhydramnios. So when there's polyhydramnios, it can be a problem. So another thing that another clinical malformation of this esophagus can also be esophageal stenosis, when the lower one third of the esophagus is what narrow due to maybe there's no recanalization, maybe recanalization doesn't occur, or there's vascular issue, or the visceral mesoderm did not form very well. Any of these things can cause narrowing, and when they cause narrowing, it can also prevent amniotic passage. Sometimes if also the esophagus did not lengthen too, it can also be affected. If esophagus did not lengthen, what will happen? It will remain in the thoracic part, and if it remains in the thoracic part, the stomach also will remain in the thoracic part, and most of the GIT will be there, so which will cause what we call diaphragmatic hernia, congenital diaphragmatic hernia, or congenital esophageal hiatus. Don't forget it. So hope it all makes sense and you understand what esophagus is. It's very, very easy. So we have explained all through the part of the esophagus, because at first the esophagus is short and it's formed from the posterior part of the tracheoesophageal septum, and it descends due to the lungs and the stomach. So next we'll be going to the development of the stomach. Keep staying here and continue watching all my videos, and subscribe. Don't forget. Bye bye.